Welcome to today's Advocacy Power Hour with the American Counseling Association. My name is Dania Lofton, and I am a Government Affairs Specialist with the American Counseling Association. Each month, the American Counseling Association hosts an Advocacy Power Hour so that we can provide our members and advocates legislative updates on ACA's advocacy efforts, as well as provide advocacy training, as well as interface with our members and advocates and allow our advocates to engage with other members across the country and exchange ideas and best practices when it comes to advocacy. This month, we are focusing on climate change and mental health. We have a very well balanced panel of professionals in the counseling field, policy profession, as well as advocacy. Our goals today are to encourage our members to become vigilant when it comes to climate change advocacy, as well as educate them on climate change and its impact on mental health so that they are more aware of how they can participate in these advocacy efforts. I'd like to now take a moment and introduce the panel. First up, we have Dr. Mark Stauffer, who is a core faculty in the mental health counseling program at Walden University. He specialized in couples, marriage, and family counseling during his graduate work in the counselor education program at Portland State University, where he received his master's degree. He received his doctoral degree from Oregon State University, Department of Teacher and Counselor Education. As a clinician, Dr. Stauffer has worked in the Portland metro area in Oregon at crisis centers and other nonprofit organizations working with low-income individuals, couples and families, homeless adults, and youth. His research interests are focused on meditation, mindfulness, nature connection and deep ecology, social justice, climate change effects and response, and climate justice. He has served as co-chair of the American Counseling Association International Committee and as president of the Association of Humanistic Counseling, AHC, from 2018 to 2019. He is on the ACA Climate Change Task Force and chair of the ACES Financial Investment Committee. Dr. Stauffer was a Chi Sigma Iota International Fellow and was awarded the American Counseling Association's Emerging Leaders Training Grant, as well as the U.S. President's Volunteer Service Award. Dr. Stauffer also won AHC's Humanistic Leadership Award in 2020. He organized and co-chaired the AHC 2019 conference, Counseling in the Age of Climate Change, International Collaboration, and Cross-Cultural Action. We're also joined by Dr. Frederick Gordon, who joined the faculty at East Tennessee State University in 2019 after completing his PhD at the University of Southern California and serving as department chair and MPA director at Columbus State University. He serves as MPA director and is the lead faculty member in helping the MPA program seek national accreditation, as well as launch its inaugural online program scheduled for fall 2021. He teaches a variety of graduate public administration classes and is the author of several publications, which include Freshwater Resources and Interstate Cooperation Strategies to Mitigate an Environmental Risk in 2008. He was the lead editor for International Environmental Justice, Competing Claims and Perspectives in 2012. And his latest book is The Damning of the Presidency, How Environmental Factors Impact a Political Campaign, which was published in 2020. We're also joined today by Jasmine Sanders. She is a climate scientist, strategist, advocate, and native of Monroe, Louisiana. She is the executive director of Our Climate, a climate change advocacy organization energized by its youth grassroots movement. Striving to raise awareness to the intersecting effects of climate change in the communities of color who are disproportionately affected by climate change, she utilizes the positivity that results from uplifting our youth to make a global impact. Previously, she managed the strategic initiatives and special projects for HIAS, wrote legislative briefs for the U.S. House of Representatives Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and fellowed for Terpstra Associates, a DC lobbying firm where she advocated on Capitol Hill for agricultural and environmental issues. She earned a graduate degree from the University of Essex with a Master of Science in Tropical Marine Biology. Ms. Sanders is a graduate from the University of South Alabama with a BS in Biology and a minor in Spanish. So welcome to our panel today. To start, I want to share that science tells us that climate change is real. However, if you don't believe in or trust the science, certainly recent weather events of the past, especially those in the last decade, tell us that climate change is real. We've had the California wildfires in 2018 and Hurricane Maria, which devastated Puerto Rico that same year. We have the recent weather events in Texas with Hurricane Harvey and this year with the ice storm. So we know that climate change is real and it must be addressed. But before we can get there, we need to know what exactly is climate change. So Dr. Gordon, I want to kick this question over to you and ask you to tell us what climate change is.
Sure, thank you. Well, climate change is a disruption to weather patterns, whether it's globally or regionally. It has long-term impacts, particularly to vulnerable groups, but it really can disrupt and really impact multiple levels of society. The culprit, a lot of it has to do with the burning of fossil fuels. The increase of age of industrialization has increased that rate and ultimately has placed the greater volume of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, which in turn has trapped Earth's rays or the sunlight and ultimately has increased temperatures. The implications to this are long-standing because a few degree temperature increase over the next several years could really dislodge society, and it knows no boundaries. It can cross from whatever continent, but the critical thing is it can result in weather pattern disturbances, violent storms, as you've mentioned, and ultimately the recourse has to be multifold. And by that I mean that you need state and national, state, local leaders, the public support to understand the urgency of what really is at stake. In the past, there have been international consensus to address climate change matters, but at the end of the day, a lot of those accords have been hard to realize. The bottom line is that in terms of having an effective agreement or even to address these issues, you need the United States role, you need other developed nations support, as well as the general global support. But it's a very serious concern, and ultimately what I believe is that it really can only be maintained and managed when people understand its urgency.
Thank you. And knowing that it's a serious matter, I do want to pitch this next question over to Jasmine and ask you, what are the risks of climate change?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. You know, in past years, we've only really talked about the environmental and the financial risk of climate change. We haven't really broken that down and said, what's the health, the migratory, the racial, the food insecurity, the housing, the mental, the sociocultural. We're only starting to dive into each of these risks and how they are all interconnected in most recent years. My organization in particular, Our Climate, challenges students to make connections between other movements for both social and environmental justice, really challenging them on this and partnering with other organizations who aren't directly in the environmental field, but what we work on is climate justice and environmental justice, really trying to raise awareness around what each of these risks are and how, I guess I like to put it as all those impacts I just said, if you put them in a hat and then you put climate change on top, it's just this huge disproportion that various groups experience. And so you have the frontline communities, which includes communities of color, coastal communities, low income communities. But then you also talk about individuals with disabilities, you talk about women, you talk about children. And so when you start to break it down like that and see how we are all impacted by this, there are risks for each of us, but just due to some of the inequities that have been in the United States and around the world, even being born a woman, you are, more than 80% of the people displaced by climate change are women, and women are more vulnerable to, the risk of climate change just due to there being inequities. So the risk is everywhere. And I think this is how we have to think about things whenever we are trying to tackle and mitigate the climate crisis.
I smiled because you answered like my next question. So now I'm like, oh, I'll just skip over this next one, which is, does climate change only affect those who are experiencing, the wildfires? If you live in California, there's a wildfire. Does that only affect those people, or does it affect all of us?
Dania, just to back up that, what I think at least from my perspective, and I think a lot of this is echoed out there, climate crisis is an existential crisis. It's really, if you had, like a war, let's just take a hypothetical one in the past, and you dropped, in an area, the ripple effects out would first start really heavily with those who are most vulnerable in the middle of that, with their physical well-being, their mental well-being, their life, having to flee and be refugees from that place. But we're talking about our whole globe. This is a ripple effect going out all over the place in many different ways. There's no safety zone of sorts, but it also improportionately impacts people in the middle of those things, which I think, Jasmine, I feel like you really spoke to. So this, and another place in that is this notion of separateness, it's climate change and mental health are about as separate as physical health from mental health, or from community health and individual health. There was this point about like pulling together these dots, and I was just thinking this morning about how, fracking would happen, or some kind of industrial complex would get put down, and people would start to experience cancer over time. And you couldn't get the exact data, but over time, people knew, like, this is about this. This is getting into our water. This is getting in here. And that's what I think the mental health and other social sciences are pulling together the dots that the hard scientists have really found with climate change.
That's a great point, Mark. And one thing I would add to it, you were talking about the migration flows. So those influxes of people after something traumatic happens, such as the wildfires or such as Hurricane Katrina. What are the effects on the community and the economy of where people go? So when Katrina happened, and many people then moved their whole entire lives to Houston, Texas, because nothing was left. And it's not just that they lost their house, they lost their livelihoods. More than 70% of the businesses were done. And there was $150 billion. That was the estimated cost. So that's the cost to a region. We're told that it's going to cost the world $7.9 trillion by 2050. So we have to think about what's it costing the individual, the family unit, the community that they came from, and the community that they're going to. How do we mentally prepare for hearing unsurvivable storm surges? That's what my hometown of Monroe, Louisiana had to prepare for as hurricanes Laura and Sally this past year were coming. It's not just preparing for, a hurricane and you board up your house. It's now, unsurvivable storm surges are happening. So my house might really be gone because power outages are going on for over a week. I'm losing all of my food that's in my fridge. And this is in the middle of a pandemic. So I think you were spot on with talking about those migratory flows, and are communities prepared for this happening more often? 40% of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of a coast. So it is inevitable that we are going to be migrating. There's the great migration that's happening from Central and South America right now, due to various droughts that are going on. That's another thing that's going on with climate change, and we don't necessarily think about it, the agricultural point of view. Yeah.
Thank you. Those are all excellent points, and kind of it leads us into our next question, which is for Mark. Climate change is a public health concern, especially for individuals with mental health disorders. In 2015, The Lancet, which is an independent general medical journal, international journal, they reported that the impacts of climate change cause anxiety-related responses, in addition to chronic and severe mental health disorders. Can you talk more about that direct connection between climate change and mental health?
Yeah. So, there's a lot of studies coming up, and they show up in a couple different realms around climate change and climate and mental health. And some of them are about direct impacts, speaking about for example, what Jasmine was talking about, migration. 6% of Floridians are people from Maria, from Puerto Rico, moving to Florida, and then another 6 moving there and then moving back. There's these kinds of knock-on effects and losses of place, losses of grief that arise from this. There's also the pervasiveness of the circumstances of climate change coming in. For those who have started to acknowledge the hard sciences out there, the natural mental health response is to start to prepare. And I see this process happening, and many of you counselors out there might also see that people are coming in with anxiety, with grief, with worry about their children. The World Health Organization, I think it was 2010, so it's a little while ago, thought 88% of the climate change impacts were going to happen to those under 5, which those people are now 16. So, parents are trying to figure out how to talk, what else might show up in the counseling realm is, how do we talk to this about our children? What is career counseling and college counseling, or these ideas of where future directories are to go when people have a sense that it's uncertain and not predictable? So many of the elements of how counselors in the settings of school counseling, of couples, marriage, family, of mental health, they're all being disrupted in this pervasive sense. There was another study, I think it was Business Insider a couple years ago, that said it was like 38%. The number's not exactly important. In the study, felt that people should consider climate change when thinking about family planning and whether having another child. I mean, that's a deep impact of something so essential of there. So there's a lot of terminology and nomenclature that's just popping up all the time. There's eco grief, nature deficit disorder, eco anxiety, and we'll get maybe to some of that in a bit. And I'm sure, Jasmine in her work as an advocate is seeing that with her youth all the time. There's a sense of powerlessness. The youth of today, a privileged person such as myself, I can check off the list of the privileges I have in a certain way. There's the older white, established folks have resources, money, power, and often they don't feel like they can do anything about this. And one of the shifts that has to happen is that not only do those people that have that privilege really need to step up, but also the children need to know that the adults and those who do have power are going to do something. Not that they won't do it on their own. And I think Jasmine works probably more with children around this and youth to speak to this, but they need to know that there's refuges, and that's a whole other crisis with our youth. it's a, so this nomenclature, there's transitional grief, there's lots of things popping up in trying to just describe the phenomena and how it's impacting how we feel about our world, how we belong in our world, how we should be relating to nature, which we are part of. I'll be quiet so others can kind of chime in on this one, because I have a feeling I'm going to get some good stuff from others here.
There's an area of study. I know environmental justice is a big area, but that goes, I think, hand in hand as an eco-criticism. It's probably more in a literature standpoint, but what it really calls for the merging of science and policy to come together to try to produce better effects. Because I think what we're talking about, we often treat the symptoms. You know, people are, whether it's eco-anxiety or concerns over climate change, but obviously try to think about proactive or ways to really make those shifts. It's really in dealing with climate change, which can go down from a broad to a narrow focus. It has to be a lot of belief in making those changes, and that they're for the best and for the betterment within society. And I think it's a very complex component. But in any event, what I was trying to say is that if we're going to look forward or try to move in that angle, yes, I think, I always believe policy is an important component, but we need the science too. And what you're, talking about is critical, and in terms of being able to identify where the vulnerable points are and what we can do, obviously, to get people to look at things just differently. They call for a lot of these accords and these agreements to move us off from fossil fuels 20%, 40%, 80%. It's really a total shift in society if we think about it, if we get to that point. And that's, it's long-reaching, but in some respects, that's something that we have to think. We have to think about that next generation.
Absolutely. So a term that I've heard a couple of times from everyone who's answered this question is eco-anxiety. So I want to ask Jasmine, I know that you work with the youth and that this is something that often comes up. Can you tell us more about eco-anxiety?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Mental health is the unforeseen risk of climate change. Eco-anxiety refers to that feeling of worry, nervousness, unease that's triggered by an awareness of the ecological threats facing the Earth due to climate change. It works on 3 levels. These relate both to changes that have already happened and the changes that are coming. So number 1, it relates to the sort of stress that's caused by watching the slow and seemingly irrevocable impacts of climate change unfold. Number 2, it stems from worrying about the future for oneself, your children, and later generations. And number 3, it's fueled by the feelings of loss, helplessness, and frustration due to our inability to feel like we're making a difference in stopping climate change. There was a recent article that came out in Scientific American entitled "Climate Anxiety is an Overwhelmingly White Phenomenon." And I challenge everyone to read it. And why is that? Instead of the anxiety by the culmination of the climate crisis, a worldwide pandemic, racial unrest, and political despair, at OC, we like to focus on resilience. Now, why is this? In addition to communities dealing with societal risk on an everyday level, this article so eloquently says, quote, "Anxiety may be a rational response to the world that climate models predict, but it is unsustainable," end quote. So at OC, we understand the importance of addressing mental health so that our youth leaders have the tools for resilience and that they are able to ensure they can continue their activism work. Our frontline youth, which 50% of the brilliant young people I work with come from frontline communities. They deal with these intersecting issues that are more than just climate impacts. And our events create access to mental health resources that will support the resilience of young people from diverse communities. In fact, late last year, we launched a new project called Resilience as Resistance, Mental Health and Climate Activism. This is serving as a platform to amplify youth voices, connect them directly to mental health providers, and form a community, a forum for them, and to be able to gain those tools, gain those resources, so that you can increase your resilience, maintain your resilience, and be able to access your resilience. And so it has been something that has been very well received. We heard directly from our young people during our policy camp last summer that this was a real thing they were dealing with. And, you know, there's a bunch of us who it's like just the climate crisis is what we're worried about. And then there's others of us who have multiple things that are on our minds all day long. And so we have to be mindful of that. We have to acknowledge that. But we can't lie in that. We have to, I think, Mark, you said it, how can we be proactive and making sure we're preparing? So we prepare through resilience as resistance.
That's good that the youth are amplifying their voices through this project with OC. As Whitney Houston told us, children are the future. But in addition to the youth, who else should be challenging climate change? Who? Counselors, everyone? This is open for anybody to answer.
Everyone should be advocating, as an individual, as a family unit, as a community. In order for us to mitigate the climate crisis, then Dr. Gordon said this, we have to make sure that there's buy-in on all levels. This is not just something that happens on the global level and we're going to think that it trickles down. Advocating looks a variety of ways. That's also something we should remember. When I was growing up, advocating looked like you had a poster in your hand and you were marching down the streets. Today, it looks like that. It also looks like what we do with our young people at OC, get them in front of elected officials, have conversations, listen, share, come up with those policy solutions. It's also where there is starting a social media campaign. I mean, everyone's on Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok. I don't even know all of the platforms these days. And, you know, that's what you can do. You can sit down with your family and have a conversation about climate change. Only 40% of Americans actually have the conversation at the dinner table or at happy hour about climate change. And for this to be such a pressing issue, we've got to increase those numbers.
You know, I just love so many parts of what you were saying. I was watching a flock of geese like round up to get out of and go migrate north. And it was really interesting. Before they migrate, so they know they have to change. It's kind of like similar to us. We know there's got to be change happening. They start kind of flicking their bills up like this, and at some point there starts to be more momentum, and then maybe one might take off and people don't buy it and it comes back. But then they start going, and then there's always stragglers. There's always these stragglers behind that are coming in late. But it's a group kind of echoing process. Well, there's a goose tipping point. You know, there's a social tipping point. So the individual actions, it could be supporting someone who's an activist. It could be joining, donating. Everybody has to be creative in their own ways to just get on board. And most importantly, just like with, you know, in working with counselors, that, you know, cultural identity development and that people might be in different places, but what's kind of important to see with the counselor in training is that they're committed or has aspirations to develop and not necessarily shame themselves, blame themselves, but just get on board and make those efforts where they're at. And the assessment might be, I have to figure out where I'm at and what I can give. And I was thinking about Resmaa Minicum's work on racial trauma and cultural trauma. And he's like, you got to do the reps, meaning like we can get tired and so we have to keep coming back to our, you know, like as Fred was saying, not just being we need to be a climate informed practitioner, not only in the hard science, but we have to be a social science and a social justice informed person. It is moving rapidly right now. There is so much change afoot. It takes a lot. So, how do we have breaks, and maybe supporting someone else too, or supporting an organization, or continuing to pass the word, helps us become that checking the heads to know if it's time to go north. I mean, that's the model. I like nature and how it teaches so much.
I think there has to be also be an element of people embracing change. So one of the things to think about, what's the impediment? Often we hear about climate issues, it's economy, or it's they can't make the technological changes and so forth. Somewhere along the lines, I think there has to be a component to realize that change is obviously it's in the people's betterment and it's the overall collective interest, but that it's not inelastic, that there can't be a substitute for their current patterns of way they're doing things. There has to be be able to alter, to change, to see that life or daily routines can be still effective or normalized, and ultimately, but still be cognizant of this issue. Obviously, Mark, you deal with mental health issues and so forth, and those are critical considerations. And Jasmine, deal with the environmental justice components and so forth. I mean, I think in both perspectives, it's really about letting people recognize that there are avenues that are out there in terms of in modifying behavior and being part of the solution. And if we think about the environmental justice movement, I was thinking about it. They already had a decade of environmental policies from the 70s, and then environmental legislation stopped, but then they pushed forward again. That's when the environmental justice movement really evidenced itself in the, back in the 1980s, and eventually it led up to federal recognition. So the point is that in terms of this climate dilemma, and that's why I would look at it, it's ascertainable. It's just a matter of really weeding through the different facets of the society, looking at the idea of change as not a impediment. It shouldn't be viewed as onerous. It shouldn't be viewed as debunked or anything in that kind of context. And that it's really, from a family standpoint, it's about people's children enjoy that, have the same opportunity in life as we did or we are. So there's a lot at stake here, and I think part of the problem with some of this issue, I feel it's like a public relations challenge. I feel that I don't think it gets enough proper protocol or good publicity in terms of how it reaches across the board ideologically into making everybody understand this issue. And of course, we see there are efforts now, certainly from the administration standpoint, push on climate change, but it should never be viewed as a political framework. I mean, it's not just simply a regulatory component from one standpoint. It's about change for the future, and that's what has to be realized.
Absolutely. Dr. Gordon, you mentioned the administration. The Biden-Harris administration is focusing heavily right now on climate change. And of course, we've discussed how this is a public health concern. And they're focusing more so on the mental health component of it. Is there any legislation out there currently that mentions mental health and climate change?
From that standpoint, I would defer to Mark and one from the mental health capacity. What I would say is that in terms of effective change, the United States' role is clearly needed. If put it in simple terms, if some of the data suggests that to make any real impact from a climate is to see a 55% reduction of carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in the United States contributes for 30%, then ultimately you need the United States role there. In terms of that other area, I'm not sure in terms of the specific proposed legislation just for that particular framework.
Well,
Well, from a mental health perspective, I don't know anything that's happening. I mean, the administration's just hopped on board. I guess some of the thing that I'm considering as far as mental health counselors is that, with the tipping points in our environment and likely changes, I think with this recent like Texas event that you mentioned, Dania, I'll just use that one as an example of just some slight degrees change, and then it just kind of really disrupted the whole system. Or even with COVID, how completely it disrupted things and then moved down into like mental health, just even the mental health of children and needing to interact. There are many aspects and many really speak to this, but the extractive, usurious, economic way of being is not sustainable. That may be disrupted just right along with, and likely it will be disrupted along with that. That will cause a lot of social upheaval, possibly. I mean, I don't know the future or anything, but it also provides the opportunity for doing a system that is more socially just, more environmentally caring and loving, and where people feel more deeply part of and belonging to this place where we are at. This is my words. Other people have said similar things, and it is the reason why part of the mental health strategy is things like resilience within oneself and within communities, and working together to strengthen not only disaster response in communities, but taking food deserts and adding food gardens. People come together, they enjoy each other's company, they bond together, and it's, a lot of the other part of the research around climate change has to do with eco-wellness, nature connection, because without loving something and without being connected to something, it's very hard to make changes to do something better for it. I was thinking about John Lewis, the great representative who, died in the last few years, and in one interview he talked about that his love for like taking care of the chickens on his farm was one of the great motivators for his advocacy throughout his whole entire life. And there's this power of, how do we more deeply connect? And when we're looking at resilience, there's a part that has to do with like dealing with the difficult stuff. But with every, as counselors know, like in a couples session, you want to spend about half time on what's not working and then back to the strength, back to the love. How do we have something, positive? And there's something that's in our DNA from thousands of years ago. And up until now, it hasn't changed with the rapidness of technology and modern inventions and industrial chemical culture, that you bring people together around fire, a harvest of some kind of food, talking, socializing, singing, dancing, having a night together, hugging, maybe, gratitudes, prayer. And you're really looking at the picture of mental health. And there's something about the system that's very vulnerable to disruption, that also doesn't have all the needs of our health and our mental health of our communities.
yes. So when we're talking about counselors and mental and behavioral health practitioners becoming a part of this advocacy process, and possibly, future legislation and policies being developed, what, Dr. Stauffer, Mark, from your point of view, a practitioner's point of view, what should LPCs want or need included in these climate change policies to address mental health? You had your wish list.
Well, I just was spouting off for a little bit, got on a little soapbox, maybe even. So I wonder if anybody else I know you addressed it at me, and I'm kind of curious because Jasmine's been working with youth, and I'm not to put you on the spot there. I have some sense of within ACA. Is that what you're really asking, Dania? Within ACA, or just? I'm sorry, I kind of messed it up.
No, just as a professional counselor, what do you think that these policies should include when we start talking about climate change and mental health?
On the greater level, yeah. I mean, really, social justice and environmental justice can't be separate. There's number one right there. It's so deeply important, and there's I'm not really a Washington, D.C. politician space, but I would say the general framework is that the needs of the next generation, not just the ones that are here and young, and not the ones that are, and even the ones that are not born, and not just human beings, non-humans as well. They have to be part of the policy. And there's a business as usual practice, and it may take disruption before that changes. I don't know, because the inertia in business as usual has not been working. So sometimes I worry about the exact little policies. They're practical, but sometimes they're also within that old system that of privilege and power. And I'm not always good at speaking to that because I'm a counselor. I think the two other guests here have maybe a lot more to say on that. Sorry if I'm not getting to that correctly.
No, you're good. Did anyone else want to?
I mean, I would just add and say that I agree, social justice and climate justice have to be tied together. And we have to make sure that all of the policies that are drafted and introduced and passed, there have to be implementation pathways on all levels. And sometimes that is where the gap is. And I guess the last thing I would add to that is putting together an actual task force that's directly tied to the White House and working on this. So I don't know if the ACA Climate Change Task Force could, present this and get in contact with the appropriate people at the White House. They did just announce the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and that would be a great connection there. It's tied together. And so I think actually talking about the issues as one instead of in your siloed areas would be helpful. I'll pass it to Dr. Gordon.
Sure. I think the issue also has to be translated into terms of risk. We think about, when there's something that's potentially dangerous, there's concern, there's governmental support for that. And I think that needs to be encompassed in terms of climate change and mental health as well. The concerns, the risk. Often things are labeled in parts per billion or parts per million. That constitutes a risk, and we use a precautionary principle. When in doubt, you don't do it. And I think that kind of terminology needs to be tied into climate change and goodness and wellness. And I think that is I think that's where what the near horizon challenge is all about, because I think people can connect to the idea that, hey, this is not something that could happen a long time from now, but it's actually affecting each and every one of us now. That makes a big difference. And that's encouraging about environmental justice task force at the White House. I mean, federal support has been there for quite some time. One of the major issues, just from that standpoint, is to make sure that there's equitable responses to each case, because that's another component. It's one thing to recognize, it's another thing the actions. And from my perspective, we need to take that term risk and make it and operationalize it so everybody understands really what's at stake. And when we talk about the family unit or even an individual, to impact them in a negative way, that's too much of a risk and too great a loss.
You know, now that you've mentioned some of these things, I think my mind's on the right track of what you're trying to get to. I wasn't catching exactly what, where I was supposed to go with this, because, but I was listening to a show where they were saying one proposal was that all these California homes, some of them in the $8 million range or something. California, somebody proposed like maybe buying them out and then renting them so that there wouldn't be all these loss of homes. And one thing that as a policy that could happen is we need greater amounts of money and hired counselors to deal with community resilience around adaptation, mitigation, and from within those communities. And then also resilience, community leaders, coaches that help tie communities together, to help with city planners who sometimes have the urge to like reinvest money back into systems that aren't working and aren't sustainable, to also have mental health as maybe even an office or something of the sort, or maybe one of the CDC or one of the more government officials to really focus on climate change and how things like insurability of properties and what to do with renters. There's all kinds of things that fall apart with natural disasters, but also with, when we get 6% of, refugees into Florida, how are they being cared for, not just as, a home, like, in homeless services, that was kind of old school, like they just need a physical something, and not worrying about their dignity, about a lot of other types of things. So, policies would have to do with better organization around just recognizing what even like Department of Defense recognizes, that there's going to be a lot of implications to people who are migrating and how they should be treated as physical, mental, spiritual, cultural beings of worth. So there's it's all over the place. So yeah.
Thank you. So as we start to come to an end on this, I know this is a really broad topic that we could go on and on about, but earlier we talked about it's everyone's job to advocate for these policies. How can mental health counselors, school counselors, counselors in the various settings become more involved? Do they start at the local level? Do they jump straight to their state legislators, federal legislators? What advice do we give them? And anyone can start on this one.
I'll go first. For me, I would say it's getting involved on every level. And I would welcome you to get in contact with me and become part of our Resilience as Resistance project. I would say that this is something that should be brought up if it's on the local level, meeting with city council, seeing if there is a community level group that could be formed. That's a mixture of community leaders that's talking about this, because again, you want to build up resilience from the local community level. This is where people are going to feel things first and the heaviest. So those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, I would think it has to start with, just start with local level, city officials, interfacing with public health, with practitioners and so forth. So to me, it's a local level endeavor. That seems to be an important way to get the message out and to ultimately create group identity and issue salience.
So the local level, being part of that tipping point, social tipping point, putting oneself in there. And I mentioned early, counselors, if we're going to have people in with anxiety, grief, or helping with resilience, we have to do the work ourselves. And so, sometimes when we talk about doing things, that's the outside behavioral, but often, it's like starting with myself, with my aspirations, my motivations, my commitments. And I have found with myself, and I can't speak for others, but I think a lot of people are speaking to that. There are some emotional landscapes to go through in really embracing what's happening. Some have gone through those in other realms of their life, other traumas possibly, but there's personal, intergenerational, cultural traumas. As counselors, we have to do that work before we're ready to kind of help others. So the personal work part of it, be informed, climate, place, that makes us better able to help. And at the same time, we don't have to wait for that. We can also, in our role, I found supporting others, hosting retreats for climate activists, being there to, do that active listening to catching others, supporting children as a school counselor. And there's also, like Jasmine was saying, on multiple levels, there's advocacy, on behalf of, but also advocacy, helping others advocate for themselves on the micro level, the medium level, and the macro level. And some of us are going to feel more comfortable at different, levels of those, and do that self-care so you keep in the game with it, and be kind to yourself and those that are alongside you in holding those aspirations there. And I just, as one last point for myself is I've really tried to focus on doing this for others, and also knowing that I need to do it for myself as well. That even if my sense is like for other beings, for children and next generation, and really listening to those voices. So getting in the reps and staying involved is really critical in that.
So what we do know is that there are scientific warnings that say that the greenhouse gas emissions are continuing to increase, and that during the 2020s, weather will be even more extreme. And so it's going to exacerbate the issues that people are experiencing now due to these weather events. I think it's really important that to the counselors watching this, to the advocates watching this, to know that it is very important for you to be vigilant, continue to educate yourselves on these impacts of climate change, but most importantly, to be involved in the advocacy efforts at all levels, like the panel has shared today. It is critical. Your voice counts when it comes to policy change. We need you, your expertise. I just want to pass it back to the panel one more time to ask for any final words, and to tell us where we can contact you if there's more information, social media handles, anything like that. So I'll pitch it over to Jasmine first.
Just thank you so much for having this panel. It's such a critical issue. You can find Our Climate at www.ourclimate.us. We are also on all social media, so at Our Climate Leaders. And you can also follow me on Instagram. It's at Jasmine Charice 1031. That's Jasmine, CHARICE 1031. And, Pick up the phone, send an email, but get involved. That's how we can do this.
Dr. Gordon.
Okay, well, you can find me over at East Tennessee State, our Department of Political Science, International Affairs, and Public Administration. We have an active website. We will have an online program coming up, so you can always check that out. But if you need to reach me, it's gordonfd@etsu.edu. I'll be happy to discuss further any of these climate concerns. And again, appreciative, Danny, to you and to ACA for hosting this very valuable and informative program.
Dr. Stauffer, it's on you.
Yeah, so I'm part of the ACA Climate Change Task Force, and sometimes what can happen, at least I've noticed with myself, is I think there's a body like kind of in charge of something, and then I kind of think someone else is handling it or whatever else. Really, it takes so many people more stepping up. No one's like got the forefront and it's on their shoulders and they're going to take off with it. We need counselors from all of our different divisions of diverse counseling settings, diverse backgrounds culturally to be part of this. And we're still in the process of organizing. And you can email me at mark.stauffer@waldenu.edu, mail.waldenu.edu. And well, I think we'll have contact information, right, Dania? There is a climate change interest network. The interest networks, the ACA Connect kind of works a little bit as far as connecting, but I think we're working to do some more with, we did a booth at ACES the previous year, just to kind of say, how are we organizing and how are counselors responding? Because really this issue along with social justice really is one that is needing to be infused in not only the textbooks and the counseling process and so many other things, and that really requires our whole community of counselors.
Well, again, thank you all to the panel for joining us. You have provided us a wealth of information. Please visit our ACA Government Affairs webpage at counseling.org and select the Government Affairs tab, or feel free to send us an email at advocacy@counseling.org. That's ADVOCACY @counseling.org. Thank you very much, and we'll see you for our next Advocacy Power Hour.